That's great.
Darin, great
Thank
to have you with us. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thanks, Peter, and thanks everyone for joining us. I was saying to Peter before we started that down here in Oxfordshire, it was kind of our first day where we felt like the sun didn't actually burn out, and it might actually get warmer this year. So if this webinar was taking place down here, I'm not sure anybody would have shown up on the screen. So thank you for showing up, and we'll keep this to a tight hour, and I think there'll be plenty of practical things for you to take away. I'll point you to some more places where you can explore some of what we talk about further. And I'll share a little bit about why I have a really dodgy accent and some of my background as we go along here. But I think from the start, I just want to say, I do think all of us want to do better at sharing our faith. And I think we especially want the people in our church to be able to be better at sharing faith. And there's a lot of really encouraging research that's been coming out. I don't know how many email newsletters you get coming into your inbox, how many things you're signed up to, but let me just see if I can share my screen here. All right, so hopefully, are you all seeing the Talking Jesus slide here? Perfect. So yeah, lots of really encouraging research to get us as Christians sharing our faith more regularly. So the Talking Jesus, 1 in 5 adults, 1 in 6 young people are more open to having an encounter with Jesus. Let me just get my buttons working here. Barna has a new piece of research called Spiritually Open, and it talks about the percentage of adults who are and teens who are spiritually open. So yeah, lots of encouragement of, hey, the people out there actually might be willing to listen to us if we open our mouths and talk about faith. But then just a couple of weeks ago in my inbox, I signed up to the Premier Christianity news feed. And this was the the statistic I saw. 96% of us as Christians are not leading anybody to Jesus. So we could pick apart what do we mean by leading anybody to Jesus, but 96% of us are not sharing our faith. So why is that? I wanna unpack a little bit of that. But I thought maybe we'll just start with a little check-in here. So we're not going to split into breakout groups or anything like that. So this is just a moment for you to reflect as we come into this time here. I've got a little gauge there. How are you feeling about sharing your faith? And if you kind of had to draw a needle on that gauge, where would you put that needle about how excited you are? And then how about your church? If you had to kind of draw the needle for your church, where on that gauge would you put it? So just take a moment, reflect on that yourself, maybe even have a little conversation with the Father right now and say, Father, this is how I'm feeling, if I'm just honest, when it comes to sharing my faith. And maybe ask him, why is that? Why am I feeling that way? So I'll be quiet for a moment just to let you reflect. And yeah, just again, take a moment to talk to the Father and say, God, this is how I'm feeling about it. And what do you want to say about it? Friends, I do believe that the desire to share faith is there. I think we all do want to be better at it. I think most of the people in our churches want to be better at it. But I just think the reality is we often just feel really stuck. And I think there's a lot of reasons for that. maybe we've just lost the anticipation that God is still working despite all the bad news. God is working in people's lives and in people's hearts. Oh, I think sometimes the church, as churches, we have unhelpful pictures of evangelism, that big word for sharing our faith. So I know our church has we have someone on staff who's called a missioner theologian. You can tell I'm in an Anglican church probably with a title like that. Like, what is it? What is even a missioner theologian? I don't really know, but so we have him come up in front of church and share stories quite often about the chances he has to talk about Jesus and share his faith and help people pray to receive Christ. And it is really encouraging, but at the same time, I think it can be quite demotivating for the average person in our church, because he talks about going out and wearing his dog collar and going on the train, or going to a cathedral and meeting somebody who's praying and then quoting C.S. Lewis. And it just makes us all feel like, okay, number one, I don't wear a dog collar. Number two, I don't tend to hang out in cathedrals, and I can't really quote any C.S. Lewis other than like maybe Spare or Mr. Tumnus or something, nothing really profound, just Chronicles of Narnia kind of stuff. So as inspiring as those stories from the front are, I think it also kind of demotivates the normal Christians like us from sharing faith. Maybe it's, there's so many needs in our churches already. The Christians who are already gathered in our churches, the needs are so great. Do I really want to add more people and more mess to that mix? So we kind of just run out of time to reach out, I think. But I don't want to give up, and I don't think you want to give up either. There's something for me when I have opportunities to talk about eternal things and talk about faith with somebody who doesn't know God. I just get this feeling of like, I feel alive, and I feel like this is what life is meant for. And I had that this weekend, actually, last Friday. I have two teenage daughters, and one is driving and one is learning to drive. And so we needed a new second car, just a used car. And probably my least favorite thing in the world is trying to buy a used car, because I'm not a great negotiator. And so I was like, oh, I got to do this. And I'm praying for God to show us the right car and make a good decision. And I looked on Auto Trader for a few weeks. And then last Friday, it finally came time for me to go see this car that might be the car. And long story short, it was just this really cool encounter where the man who was selling the car quite early on said, I've just been diagnosed with bowel cancer. And he shared a little bit about his treatment, and I asked him where he is, if he had faith, and how is he getting through this, and how is he having strength. And it just ended up I was able to pray for him, and just a simple prayer of, God, would you be with this man? We'll call him Carl, let's say. Would you be with him? And would you help him to know that you're for him, and that you want to walk alongside him through this cancer treatment? And obviously, yeah, our desire, Father, would be that you would heal him, but most of all, would you help him to feel your presence? And I just left that, what was going to be this mundane, my worst thing in the world, buying a used car. And I left that just kind of walking on air, just feeling like, oh yeah, I love that feeling of getting to talk about eternal things. And I want to feel that more often. And I want my Christian friends, and I want the people in my church to be able to experience that more regularly as well. I don't want to give up on sharing faith. But again, I think we often feel quite stuck. And I want to share 3 reasons why I think we feel stuck. There's more than 3. But these are 3 that we've bumped up against, kind of in our experience, my wife and I, in some of the youth groups and the churches that we've helped to lead. So there's more than 3 sticking points, but these are the 3 that we've bumped up against along the way. And I want to share a bit about what we're learning about how to get unstuck. And I just want to be honest and say we have had a lot to learn, and we still are learning. And it all started about over 25 years ago. My first ever overseas experience, you can tell with my accent, my dodgy accent, I'm originally from the States. But when I was in university, a friend invited me to come along on a summer ministry trip. And so my first ever overseas experience was in Glasgow, Scotland. And I thought, this is going to be great because we speak the same language and we can help this little church run their holiday club. And then I got off the plane and we landed and we started working with this church. It's like, I don't understand a word that anybody is saying. So right from then I knew, okay, everything I think I know, I've got a lot to learn and relearn. But these are three reasons and three ways we've gotten stuck as we've tried to share faith, both as individuals, but also collectively as our youth group or as our church. And I'm gonna go through them in reverse order, because I actually think the third sticking point is the one that's the least talked about in church circles right now. And then we'll work our way backwards. And we're actually gonna go quite quickly. It's gonna be a bit of a whistle-stop tour. So I hope you can grab at least a couple things that fit where you are at on this journey. And like I said, I'll point you to some more places where you can keep building on this and learn a bit more if you'd like to. So we landed our first church, the church in Scotland was just kind of a summer ministry, but God used that to call my wife and I to the UK longer term. So we moved in 2003. We moved to a little town called Bicester, which is in Oxfordshire, just about 10 miles from Oxford. And we worked with a local church, and really quickly, we learned how to build relationships. We went into the schools and we did mentoring and held lunch clubs. We put on games nights. At one point, we started a drop-in at Costa Coffee on the high street, which actually became a church plant for all ages. So we would do various activities to gather young people. And we found out that we actually were pretty good at gathering young people and building relationships. But then when it came time to share about our faith, that's when it got really difficult, because all the things that we learned on these ministry or mission trips and all the things that my wife and I learned in Bible college, it just felt like that's not at all where these young people were starting from. So we started with Jesus and how Jesus can forgive our sins. We talked about the Bible and how we can know the Bible is credible and it's real. And we talked about heaven and how we can know that where we're going when we die. And it was just like, we spent a lot of time answering questions that young people were not asking. And we got more and more frustrated and felt more and more stuck. And it wasn't that young people were against the Christian faith. They were really glad that we had faith. But it just didn't feel like what we were talking about related to them in any way, or that they thought that it related to them in any way. And actually, most of these young people, so they were generations removed from God in the church. So maybe they had a nan that went to church at Christmas or Easter. But they actually believed there was a person 2,000 years ago named Jesus who lived. And they're like, well, yeah, he probably rose again from the dead. It's just like, oh man, they believe all the right facts, but they were like, so what? What difference could that possibly make in my life? And what we found is the gospel didn't really sound like good news to people who weren't looking for God. And the fact that Jesus can forgive our sins, it's like, well, I'm not looking for God. And so the fact that you're telling me that I've done things wrong against God and those things stand between me and having a relationship with him and having eternal life, like that just all sounds like information, because I'm not looking for God. I'm not interested in him. So it felt like we just weren't starting at the right starting point. and we had to find a different way. We had to find new starting points, and that's where I think we felt a lot like Paul in Acts 17, which Peter read for us. And yeah, I'd really encourage you to dig into that a bit more on your own and unpack it a bit more, because we know that Paul was the apostle that was sent to the Gentiles, or the non-Jews. But it seemed like early on in his ministry, he still kind of played it safe. And when he would come into a new town or a new city, you saw him in the synagogues or in the Jewish places of worship, or talking with people who already had a grasp of God. And so his main message was, hey, I want to introduce you to Jesus. You need to know who Jesus is, because he's the Messiah that you've been looking for. But there's this real turning point in Acts 17 where Paul finally, it seems like he finally got out of the synagogues and the Jewish God-fearing people and finally went out into the marketplace with the Gentiles. And we'll come back to this in a moment, but I think it's really interesting to see Paul's message was the same to the Gentiles, but his starting point was very different. He didn't start with, you've crucified the Messiah. He started a lot further back. So where is our culture at? So, that Paul understood his culture and he knew where to start. Where is our culture at when it comes to faith? Well, I'm not sure if you guys have heard of Youthscape down here in Luton. It's a significant youth organization that trains and resources the church. And a few years back, so one of my friends directs it. A few years back, they did this really big piece of research. I think they spent a lot of money on it, and they wanted to find out what young people thought about life, about death, and about the Christian faith. So they gathered a whole group of young people from kind of across the 4 countries and across all sections of society, got them in the room, and they're going to start this research. And basically, what the young people said is, we don't really have any questions. we're not asking those kinds of things. Youthscape was just released a really recent, just hot off the press, another piece of research called Translating God. And one of the headlines of that research is, we're dealing with warm apathy. So again, not against God, not against Christianity, but more of a you do you. It's good for you, but I'm not interested in it. And then when we unpack the Talking Jesus research a little further, and I just pulled out another slide here, but again, when they wanted to know what questions people outside the church are asking, and can you see the highest percent of what the response was? Not asking any of those questions. Those aren't the questions I'm asking. Alistair McGrath has written extensively about this, going way back into the 1990s. That really what we're facing now, one of the biggest barriers is the relevancy barrier. So people aren't so much starting with wondering if the Christian faith is true or not, but why would it matter? What difference does it make? I'll send this I'll send the slides to Peter and he can email it on to you. So if I'm going too quickly and you're missing things and wanting to write down sources and titles, don't worry, you can pick that up from the slides. But what is this relevancy barrier? What is it? It sounds like this. Again, not so much, the questions that people are asking are very practical. It's not so much, does God exist, but why would it matter? Or this one, how could it make my life better? So I want to tell you a little story about a friend. I'll call him Colin. That's not his real name, but since we're recording, I'll change his name for privacy. So Colin is a dad of our daughter's friends. And so we got to know Colin and his wife from doing the school drop off in the school collection day after day. And we actually invited Colin to come to, my Christian friend and I invited Colin to come to a Bible study, kind of a discovery Bible study that we were going to do. And surprise, surprise, Colin took us up on the invitation. And so every fortnight we would meet in the front room and we would read the Bible, or we would read a little devotional book and chat about it. And every week we'd kind of go around and say, have you done the reading? What stood out to you in the reading, and what questions do you have? And what does that make you think about God or about Jesus? So Colin, I mean, to my surprise, he came to the group first of all, and he came every week. And every week he did the reading. So just blown away, not from a church background, not from any kind of a church family or faith background, but he came every time, he did the reading. But every time we got to his turn, and we asked him, all right, Colin, what questions did you have, or what did you get out of it? He would just be like, I I didn't really get anything out of it. And no, I don't really have any questions. And week after week after week, this went by, and finally I got the clue that I probably need to meet up with Colin outside of the group and have a little chat. So um, I can still see it. We went to Pratt, and I can still see the table we're sitting at, sitting across. And I decided, I mean, I knew Colin really well by this point, so I decided to jump right in and get straight to the point. And I said, man, Colin, huge props to you, because you come week after week after week to our Bible study. You don't have faith yet, but you're so consistent. I so appreciate that. But I can tell you're not getting much out of it. So let me ask you a question. Let me ask you a question, Colin. Do you feel like you need God? And he paused, and he looked at me, and he said, this probably sounds really arrogant, but no. And this probably sounds like a business transaction, but I'd have to see, like, how could it make my life any better? And I was just blown away, because I thought we had been doing such a great job of modeling how God was making a difference in our lives, and some of the things we were struggling with, and how God was meeting our needs and giving us peace. And it was just all just going right over his head and just going past him. And I mean, obviously there is a spiritual battle going on as well, but I think that example just encapsulates my experience of where I feel like most of my conversations with people outside the church are. I'm not real interested. I don't really have a lot of questions, and I'm not really shopping for God at the moment. So I'm glad that you found a great car, but I'm not shopping for a car right now. So yeah, I wonder if you can relate to that. I wonder if you have any examples of when you tried to share faith, and the person wasn't against it, and they were happy you have faith, but it was just kind of like, I guess as the youth would say these days, just meh, just so what? And because I think we can multitask, I'm going to keep going here. But if you can resonate with that, why don't you go into the little chat box here? So open up the chat. In mine, I have to click on the more and then the chat. But if you can relate, say, yeah, I can relate to that. Or maybe you even want to share a little quick example of, yeah, I had this conversation, and this is when I felt myself bumping against that relevancy barrier. So if you have an example to share, put it in the chat. We're not going to read all of them out, but if you get tired of listening to me, go into the chat and you could read some other people's stories and examples, or you can just put, yes, I feel the same way. And I'll give you just a second, and then we'll catch our breath here and move forward in another 30 seconds or so. I suppose we could have even done the thumbs up reaction as well if we wanted to get really zoomy here, but oh, thank you, Gorbridge Parish Church Youth Council. Great. Keep those coming. We're not going to read them all out or even stop, but I'm going to keep us rolling forward here. So I think many of us sense, yeah, that we can relate to that. The relevancy barrier is a real thing. That's a big sticking point. That's where the culture is at. But unfortunately, I don't think our tools and our resources as Christians have changed all that much over a number of years. Um, so we love Alpha. We've run Alpha loads of times. Our church still runs Alpha. My friend is the director of Christianity Explored. I love him. I love what they do. I love the Chosen. Um, but most of the people I talk with, my neighbors and my friends outside the church, or all the non-church youth we worked with, they're not asking the Alpha questions yet. I think Alpha is great if you're seeking and if you're asking the questions. But if you're not asking those kind of questions, if you're way back on the scale of just simply indifference, I haven't found those tools to be very effective. So we've started to ask, as we've used these tools, and again, it felt like we were answering questions that not many people were asking. We've started to wonder, is it possible? Is it possible to stir curiosity? Can we start where the culture or the average person is starting and stir curiosity? And this is where we don't have time to unpack the whole thing now, but at the end, I'll tell you where you can read some more about this or watch some more about it if this piques your interest. But this is where we went back to Paul and said, Paul was starting with a non-church, well, there was Christians for the first time I'd seen, but yeah, non-Jewish audience. And again, I find his starting point really, really helpful, because he doesn't start with, you crucified the Messiah, because they weren't looking for a Messiah. Instead, he starts with God, and he says, although it might feel like it, God isn't far from any one of us. He's there waiting to be found. And actually, he's working inside of us, because even as our own authors and our poets say, and here Paul is quoting the italics, but it's quoting a couple famous poets of the time. In him we live and move and have our being. And so we've found, just to cut a long story short, and I'll tell you where you can look at this further, but we found a really helpful starting point is to realize that every human being is a spiritual being. And every human is a soul. Probably better than saying every human has a soul. We are souls. We're more than a body and a brain. And we all have, let me click to the next slide. We all have these longings that have been, kind of dampened and kind of covered over in a thick layer of cultural dust, as one of my other friends likes to say, but running below the surface, often quite buried, but there's longings that point to the clue that we are spiritual beings and we have a soul. And Paul wasn't coming up with something new. What I'm going to share here isn't anything new. Paul talked about it 2,000 years ago. 1,000 years before Paul, we get this little gem from Solomon, the wisest man who was alive at the time, the third king of Israel. In Ecclesiastes, he goes on this vision quest, and he says, God has set eternity in the hearts of men. So there's something inside of us that has this God consciousness, but we can't really fathom it. And so we've started to learn to point to the longings of the soul. And I'm just going to share a few of them with you really quickly. So we've learned that people wonder where we came from. And so that can be a really good stirring point to say, isn't it interesting that even though in science you're told that we're just a body and a brain, or you listen to the Nature documentary and Sir David Attenborough tells us that we're just molecules, or Dawkins talks about we're dancing to our DNA. Isn't it interesting that as humans, we still wonder where we came from? And at that point, we don't try to prove, creation over other stories, but we just say, as humans, we wonder where we came from. And we believe that's spiritual. Or we all have this deep longing for justice. So when the powerful exploit the weak, or when a powerful country invades a weaker country, which is happening all the time, even right now in our world. There's this collective gasp from society of that shouldn't happen. Like the strong shouldn't get away with hurting the weak without any consequences. Well, why is that? If we're just simply here by chance and it's the survival of the fittest, why do we have compassion for the last and the least? And I believe that's a spiritual thing. I believe that's a little clue that you're more than a body and brain. Or prayer. Even I think everyone has tried to pray, even people who say they're not religious or they don't have any faith. Everyone at some point has tried to pray. Well, what is that? Who or what do you think you were trying to connect with when you prayed? And why do we reach out to someone or something bigger than ourselves when we're in need? The afterlife. Again, when I was younger, starting with afterlife was a big way to start evangelism. Like, do you know if you were to die tonight and stand before God in heaven, and he were to ask you, why should I let you into my kingdom? What would you say? And that was where we started gospel conversations. I don't think the afterlife is always the best place to start today, because I think our society is it feels so out of control. Most people aren't thinking about tomorrow, let alone eternity. But still, there's moments in life where people do ponder the afterlife. And I think it's a great place to start and say, do you hope there's an afterlife? What do you hope it's like? And isn't that interesting? Is that a clue about our spiritual nature? Superstition is another one that I think can be a good starting point. Worship, a sense of awe and wonder. So when we see something beautiful, maybe it's a piece of art, or maybe it's when we're out on a hike and we crest the top of the mountain and we just have that moment where it feels like everything is right with the world. Or maybe it's even when we see our two children play nicely for 10 minutes and it's just 10 minutes before they start bickering again. And we just have that sense of, wow, everything is right. But that feeling comes and it goes really quickly, and it's really hard to hang on to. But what is that feeling, and why do we long to feel it again? And is that spiritual? Is that a clue about our spiritual nature? So again, I'm just kind of flowing across the top of this, but we all have longings, and they're usually tamped down beneath the surface of everyday life. But we can learn to look for those longings of the soul and call attention to them. And we've found that this has been a really good starting point for a spiritual journey. And so when we do this, either in our individual conversations or in our groups, our outreaches and our missions, it sounds like this. We don't think that these longings can be explained by our body and our brain alone. Or just asking, where do you think that emotion comes from? That longing for justice, for the world to be right and people to be kind to each other. I don't think that can be explained by evolution. So where does that come from? That sense of wanting the last and the least to be first and to not be oppressed. Or just saying, I think that longing shows a desire, or that when you prayed, I think that showed a desire to connect with someone or something greater than yourself. Or just simply, I think that's your soul in action. Maybe that sounds kind of a funny way to put it, but again, we're giving people language for the experiences that they're in. So we're teaching them that they are a spiritual being. We're naming the spirit or the soul, which I think are really difficult, challenging things to define. But I think as people experience it, we can help them put words to that. And then again, that's just the starting point. The real turning point is then saying, you know, you don't believe this yet, but I believe that someone or that something that you are longing for is actually God. And can I start to introduce him to you? And again, I know these are just the beginning points, but I really believe that this is where our culture is at now. We can't always start with Jesus, and you can be made right with God through Jesus and expect that that's going to be solving a felt need that people are feeling right now. So it's starting further back, and I know it all sounds easy, but it's taken us a lot of practice to learn how to start there. But I think it's been really effective. So even this weekend, our neighbors on our street got together on Saturday for drinks. They do this a couple times a year. We just moved into this. We're new to the neighborhood. We just moved here in the last year. So we went along. It's a great chance to meet neighbors and have lots of conversations. And for me, people always ask, why are you here? And I tell them it's because of the weather. And then when they don't believe that, then I talk about why we actually moved to England. But it was great. So my neighbor, Roger, this is just on Saturday. He's like, well, I'm not religious. And it's like, well, okay. But I can really respect people who are religious. I don't have any problem with them, but I just feel like I can't get there. I just can't access that. But I'm really kind of into like studying the universe and quantum physics, and I've been reading all these books the last few years about quantum physics and watching these videos, and just amazed at how huge the universe is. And so I was just able to say, hey, Roger, okay, you said you're not religious. I think religion can sometimes be like a human construct or a thing that humans built, but would you say that you are spiritual? And he was like, whoa, wow. Now there's a question. Oh, I want to think about that. And then he said, I've had some experiences in my life that I can't quite explain. And again, it was just a really simple way to kind of start where Roger is starting and say, all right, religion, yeah, but would you say that you are a spiritual being? And then what about these experiences that you can't explain? Is that a clue? And again, we moved on from there. I didn't get a chance to lead him to Jesus yet. But again, I as Peter said in the beginning, I do think faith these days is more of a process than a one point in time encounter. All right, so sticking point number one, we can start where people are starting, and we can start by stirring up the longings of the soul. All right, so that was just point one. We're gonna fly through the other two sticking points, just because I know we're all at different points as churches about where we're at on mission and where we're at with equipping our church. So if you're more in the, okay, we do have a group gathered. So maybe we've started a mission activity or a mission project. So maybe you have Messy Church once a month. Maybe you're running a cafe or a moms and toddlers group. And you think, we're pretty good at building relationships, but we have no idea how to go from relationships to talking about anything spiritual or talking about Jesus and the gospel or anything to do with God, really. And I think this is really normal. You're not alone if you are stuck here. I still remember a minister I was talking with from a Methodist church, and they had started a new outreach. Well, it wasn't new anymore. It had been going for 3 or 4 years. And he said, Darin, we've been running this outreach for 3 years, and I can't think of a single person who has taken even one single step of faith in all that 3 years or shown any interest in exploring faith. So if this is where you feel stuck, you're not alone. And these are just some practical ideas of what we've done if you already have a group gathered. So again, this is going to be really practical. So you've built relationships, and now you want to start talking about faith. How can you do that? And we've tried this in all certain ways. So in our lunch clubs, or in our costed drop-in, and there was times where we would try to stop and get everybody to listen, and it just didn't work very well. Partly because it was young people, but also because they're in a cafe or they're in that kind of a setting where if you were in Cafe Nero or Costa tomorrow talking with a friend, and somebody stood up in the middle and said, "All right, everyone's going to be quiet and listen now," you'd be like, what are you doing? This is a cafe. So sometimes we've done such a good job at creating that cafe environment or that drop-in environment that you can't stop. So just some practical ideas are try to start with some stirring questions in the room. So you could have a whiteboard in the middle of the room and have a question of the week. We've done little things like putting questions on menu stands. So each table in the cafe, you have the menu stand and you put a question of the week or a couple questions. If you need help with what the questions are, again, there'll be more. I'll tell you in a moment where you can find more help on that. Or we've also just toyed around with making it visual. So you have a question and people want to see what other people's answers are. So you have some kind of object to track what people's answers are. But we found once we had gathered a group, we always wrestled with, do we have a God slot? Do we not have a God slot? Do we just build relationships? And we found that if we didn't have something to do with God during our outreach time, it was really, really difficult to then invite people to something else to explore faith. Because we hadn't flown the colors that we're Christians and we want to tell you about the gospel and tell you about God. And then when we'd kind of say, oh, come find out about faith, they're like, what are you talking about? Like, it feels like they got that bait and switch kind of thing. So I would really encourage if you're doing an outreach and you have a group gathered, find ways like this to bring it into your context. Again, that's just really practical. There's a group that we've been helping, a church. It's a village church. The numbers were dwindling. The church was basically dying, and they wanted to kind of reimagine what church could look like, because hardly anybody came on a Sunday morning. I mean, it was like a dozen people maybe. And so coming out of COVID, they decided, all right, we're going to run kind of family activities on Sunday afternoon. And they called it Great and Small. So they kind of do a craft or an outdoorsy activity where the kids could run around and families could be there. And then they'd sit down and have a little chat or have a little talk. So again, they were stuck with, they gathered a group, but they didn't know how to bring God into it. They didn't know how to bring anything spiritual into it. So we talked with them about some of these ideas. And so what they started doing is baking some cakes every time they met. And then you can see in those cakes, there's a little cocktail stick with a piece of paper. And on those pieces of paper were some verses. So that was just an easy way for them to start to, in this mission or in this project where they're building relationships and having activities, we're also going to bring some sense of God or spirituality or the gospel into it lightly, and then find out who's warm and who's interested and invite them to explore further. So again, that's just another example of how to start to drip feed if you already have a group gathered. If you do stop, there were times where we found the right context to stop and have a little 5-minute chat. And we learned to start with these more spiritual concepts about justice or longing to connect or something more. All right, so that was just real quick. We're moving ahead here. I'm watching the clock. So we talked about getting stuck with where to start. You can start by stirring spiritual longings. If you have a group gathered, but you don't know how to get into the spiritual or into anything with God, shared a few ideas like that. But you might just be saying, we don't really know how to build relationships with people outside the church. And, we could have spent the whole Zoom on this, because I think that's where a lot of us are at. I do feel like there's some really, really good help out there already if this is where you're stuck. So that's why I chose not to spend most of our time on it. I just want to point you to where you can find some help. We follow the fresh expressions model. And we just found that really helpful. When we started our Costa drop-in and planted a church through Costa, we started with listening. So listening is the first step. And you're listening to your community and listening to God. And you're asking, what need is there in our community that we can meet? And how through this meeting this need could we build community? And then once we build community, how could we start to share faith? So if you want to hear more about the fresh expressions model, you can see the website there. It was really helpful for us. There's lots of examples, lots of little videos of people who have tried different mission experiences. So if you're trying to build relationships, that's a great place. And then we've also learned a lot from a little book called Target, Leading Missional Communities for Students and Youth by Rich Atkinson. He basically tells the story of how they went from this little youth group in Sheffield to reaching 800 young people across the city in little mission projects. And the flow he talks about is contact, community, connection, commission. And here's my little, if you don't want to read the book, here's my quick summary. So just some tips. If you're trying to build relationships with people outside the church, we would really encourage you to focus on one need or one activity. I think often we like, well, we're going to do a cafe and then we're going to have sewing and we're going to have films and then we're going to have painting nails and we're going to have this. And it just gets too big and too hard to run. So it's focus on one need or one activity. And don't be afraid to try something and to build a group and then stop it. I think that's one thing as churches, we're not great at stopping things when they've run their life cycle. So it's more about trying little mission projects centered on one point of interest or one need, and building a group, building a community, and then being okay to stop the activity and continue the community, but stop the activity once the community is built. And I'd say, again, be intentional from the start. We've learned just to be direct from the outset of saying, we're Christians, we're from the church in town, or we're from the churches together, and we want to help our community. So we're going to run this Costa Coffee drop-in, or we're going to run this games night for young teenagers. So we're doing that to meet a need. We're doing that to provide a warm, dry, safe space for young people to gather. But we also, because we're Christians, we also want to offer opportunities for people to explore spirituality in general and explore the Christian faith specifically. And I think the more we've been upfront about that from the start, the easier it's been to get into conversations about God and Jesus and to invite people to explore further. All right, again, I know those are just like really, really practical tips, but again, just trying to hit a few of the common sticking points that we bumped up against in some of what we learned. So if you want to know more, we're coming into land here. If any of this has piqued your curiosity, I know this was kind of a whistle-stop tour, and I thought we might do some breakout groups to see like one thing that stuck out, but I talked too long like I normally do, and we're out of time. But if you want to find out more, you can scan that QR code. We've put a bunch of this into a video training series that you could watch on your own, or you could watch with your church, that unpacks Paul's method more and unpacks more of the stirring and gives you more examples. So you can scan the QR code or just go to start2stir.com, STARTTOSTIR. So start to stir, the words. And you can click around a little bit more there. So if that's something that you want to learn more about what I'm talking about how to stir, maybe you have a small group or you want to take your church through a little series, that's there. And then we also have developed something that we kind of call it a pre-alpha course because our young people weren't ready for alpha. So we call it the stir course, but it's kind of pre-alpha. And it's a way to start by stirring up those spiritual longings. So the first 6 weeks really are all about those spiritual longings and letting people experience that longing and then pointing to it. And then from there saying, all right, we want to introduce you to God. And if you want to know God, it's really important that you encounter Jesus. And we want to help you to learn who Jesus is. And then we want to give you opportunities to respond. We want to invite you to follow Jesus because Jesus is the one who takes us to God. And Jesus is the one who makes us right with God and gives us full life. So it kind of covers the whole, the orange pack kind of starts where Alpha or Christianity Explored starts. But the earlier packs start further back where people are starting in our culture today. So yeah, visit the website, click around on that. There's more if you want to unpack it more. But I hope I hope these just gave you a few more ideas if you're feeling stuck in these areas about where you could go next, and gave you a few tastes to chase up on later. But thanks for listening. Sorry, I went right up to the end, but Peter, I'll pass it back to you now so we can value you with the time that you committed to.
Well, thank you, Darin, for a really interesting presentation of where we are and a suggestion about stirring curiosity and respecting where people are. I think it's a very respectful process in terms of listening with something to where people are. Maybe just time for, has anybody got a question that you want to share? You're curious, or Darin very humbly in many ways didn't push too hard at the end there. If you want to ask him more about the resources or the next steps, there's the QR code. We have recorded this. I can encourage you to look at the Starting to Stir articles, which I've read because I just read them all. There's a whole series of articles there that kind of just get you going. And they're great bite-sized articles to get you thinking about just curiosity and spirituality. And you just, what does that look like or feel like? And relating to this question, well, we don't, what do we start with? But yeah, my question, anybody tonight who's here with us want to ask Darin a question? I know we've just gone over 8 o'clock, but nevertheless, anybody want to indicate a question for Darin? Graham, is that you got your hand up? Yeah, go for it.
It sounds like an obvious question, Darin. The STAR course, how do you invite people along to that, given that Alpha is for people who are already questioning?
Yeah, I think it probably depends on your context. So when we've already had young people gathered and we're starting to drip feed it, it's quite an easy invite to say, some of these things we've been talking about, you're a soul or you have a spirit. Would you like to explore that further? Then come along to this STIR course. But I think you can also just simply say, if you're interested in exploring spirituality, we'd love you to come along on this 6-week introductory course to explore, are we as humans spiritual beings? And then we're Christians, so we also want to give you invitations to explore the Christian faith after that. But just come along to this introductory to find out a little bit more about, are you more than a body and brain, or are you a spiritual being? That's how we've kind of pitched it.
Darin, can I jump in and ask where you do these conversations? Do you go to where the people who are asking them live, or do they come to you, or do you do them wherever?
Yeah, wherever. I mean, I think if you're familiar with Alpha, I think they've tended to function quite similarly to Alpha, we have done it. We've done little bite size and lunch clubs before, but we've kind of done the typical, you have an after school group, or you have an evening time where you bundle in somebody's lounge, or in a dining room or something where you get pizza in and you share a little bit of a meal, and then you have about a half hour, 45 minutes for the input time. So yeah, quite a bit like an Alpha Christianity Explorer. You have a set time and space that you invite people into that. So you do have to have some kind of a relationship or interaction with them to fish from, to invite them into that.
Any other questions? Grateful to have the Gore Bridge Massive with us in terms of just all of you there. Cool, good to see you guys. Anyone want to kind of go, I don't think so, or is it provoked in you? Any examples just to finish with? Any final comment from anybody? Yeah, go for it, Stephen.
Thank you. It was just something about language, really. You talk about spirituality, and I think I understand what it means. And I just wonder whether sometimes our language, particularly that word, creates a barrier or causes problems of understanding. What have you experienced, if anything, in that regard?
Yeah, I think we have to define it. So I think when we use it, we work hard to define. So when we say spiritual, we're talking about you have a spirit. You're more than a body and a brain. But I think I think everyone knows the word, but nobody knows what it means. So I found we've had to interpret it and put words to it. And again, I think at times I'm a little bit uncomfortable with if it starts to sound like we're different parts, like we have a body, a brain, and a spirit, and these are all different parts. It's like, well, I don't want to add to it like ancient heresy because we're holistic beings. And are we 2 parts? Are we 3 parts? Are we more parts? I don't know. So I do think we have to interpret and say what we mean by spiritual. Because I think otherwise you can get into a lot of the new age, into those kinds of things. And I think probably adults will have more of a picture of what they think you mean when you say spiritual. I think young people have no idea when we use that word.
Yes. Great. Thank you very much. Thanks.
Such a helpful presentation, Darin. Once again, just to thank you for that. Can we show our appreciation to Darin for coming along and sharing with us this evening? That's very stimulating as we often ask ourselves, what are the questions that people are asking around? It's quite humbling to kind of think of your research that Youthscape, and again, Youthscape are an excellent youth organization. You'll want to look them up online as well, but do look for Start to Stir and think about the resources. Darin, thank you so much. Really appreciate your time this evening. So folks, we just close by saying the grace to one another. May the grace of our Lord Jesus Christ and the love of God and the fellowship of the Holy Spirit be with us all forevermore. Amen. Bless you. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks everyone.